subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to get all the latest updates. Hi everyone, my name is Anita Sharma and I welcome you at Inkpot Hub Media once again. Inkpot Hub has given me some amazing opportunities, certainly, and one of them is to get to know academia thought leaders. Today, I am going to be speaking with Professor Nirmalya Kumar, one of the best thought leaders in the world. Professor Nirmalya Kumar is Professor of Marketing of the Lee Kong Chian School of Business at Singapore Management University and is a distinguished fellow at INSEAD Emerging Markets Institute. I welcome you, sir. Thank you so much for accepting my request.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So you appeared on the lists of Thinkers 50 World's Best B School Professors, 50 Most Influential Business School Professors. You have more than 24,700 citations. You have authored 9 books. You have written cases. You are a TEDx speaker. You have served on the boards of many companies like Bata India, Tata Capital, Tata Chemicals, Tata Industries, ACC Limited, Ambuja Cement, Ultratech, and many more. In 2021, in June 2021, you received the 2021 Mahajan Award for Lifetime Contribution to Marketing Strategy Research by the American Marketing Association. One of the interesting things which I've observed and learned about you is that you are an ardent modern art supporter and own the largest collection of Jamini Roy paintings outside of India. This is really incredible, sir. And you have really come a long way. You have gotten more than 30 years of work experience, a huge contribution to the literature, and so many achievements. How does it feel?
Yeah, I'm listening to my obituary, but anyway, go ahead.
No, not at all, sir. Tell me more about your journey from where you started. And have you ever thought that you would reach up to this level when you can do?
So, I started, of course, in Calcutta at La Martiniere School. And basically, that was my journey. We were from a middle-class family, so we never really imagined, the experiences that I've had. They were not part of our life chances that we thought of. And when we started, I never really thought about any particular destination I wanted to get to. All I knew that I wanted to be a professor, and that was pretty much it. I never thought that being a professor was something that was in some sense, something that would make you money. It was just something because I love learning, I love education. So that was the reason I joined it. And I never wanted to be anything else except a professor. So that's all I ever focused on. And, I never had any goals. And even now, I don't have any goals of saying, I want this award or that award. I just feel that those are things that you get for having achieved stuff, but that's not really the reason why I'm into this, So in fact, most of my awards are lying somewhere most of the time when somebody gives me an award, I leave it under the table, and then they mail it to me thinking I've forgotten it by mistake, but I'm not really, it's not what turns me on. What turns me on is basically the journey of learning and to know more and more about things. So that's what really is the prime motivator. And then from India, I managed to get to United States. And for me, that was a revelation because I'd never been overseas in my life. At the age of 23, I end up in the US. Having never been overseas, I land up in Chicago. I get a admission into the MBA program there provisionally because they're not really sure if I'm good enough to be admitted, and I don't have the money in any case. But they were very sweet. They gave me for provisional admission for 1 semester, and at the end of the semester, they basically said, you have now a scholarship for the rest of your time over here. So then that's how I started. Okay. And then from the US, I went to do a PhD at Northwestern. And after that, after some years in America, 12 years in America, I moved to Switzerland because I always wanted to live in Europe. That was really my goal, in the sense of, if you ask me, after having visited a few countries where I felt the most comfortable, I felt most comfortable in Europe. So I moved to Europe then. I'd already become a US citizen. And when I moved to Europe, I moved to IMD in Switzerland. And, we were a small school, but became one of the major institutions in the world while I was there. And then I moved from there to London because I wanted to be closer to where the action was and where the press was. So that was a very fantastic move also for me. IMD was life-changing in one way, in the sense that it made me from a marketing professor into a professor of business. It made me from somebody who was an academic into somebody who was an academic plus a consultant to the top major companies of Europe. And then when I moved to the London Business School, the big difference was the press was based over here. So I got a lot of press, and I also got a lot of India exposure, which I wouldn't have gotten had I just stayed in Switzerland, because I was starting to make about 8 to 10 trips a year to London from UK, because there was a direct flight, 10 times a day. So and so I saw the emergence of India business also from a global perspective during that period. And then after that, I got this offer to work at the Tata Group, which was, one day I'm sitting in my office, somebody calls me up to say, we have this job opening at the Tata Group as head of strategy globally. And I said, listen, I'm not interested in any company. But over time, they managed to convince me, and I said, okay, I'll come for a year, and if I like it, I'll stay. Otherwise, I'll go back, because I can get a sabbatical from London Business School. And that's what I did. But after 6 months, Cyrus Mistry, the chairman, and I got along famously. So I decided to stay. And then I stayed there till the time when Cyrus Mistry got fired, and I was the collateral collateral damage out of that, let's call it. And then, of course, I said, after all these years, I'm not going to look for a job. And I waited until somebody called me, and SMU called me, so I came here to Singapore.
Okay. Beautiful journey, sir. And it's, I think it inspires a lot of people to think in a way that when you decide to learn, automatically things fall in place, and the universe keeps on conspiring for your own achievements. So I can see a lot of your background tells us about a lot of other aspects as well of you. Tell me more about your interest in paintings and how it evolved. And your Instagram tells us a lot of photographs and images and paintings.
So basically, I really did not know anything about visual arts, because in my family, the focus was on literature and performing arts. Mm-hmm. But when I went to America, I started going to museums and seeing paintings, especially the Art Institute of Chicago, which is still one of my favorite museums in the world. Mm-hmm. And then I got exposed to painting. And then when I went to Europe, more and more I got to see the museums over there. And out of that, I learned a little bit about Indian art, and I started collecting paintings, And then when I started collecting paintings, I didn't really know anything about Indian artists. So I was learning as I went along. And then one day I saw a Jamni Roy painting for the first time in my life. And once I saw that, I fell in love. And after that, every time I went to buy a painting, a Jamni Roy versus something else, I always ended up buying the Jamni Roy. And then I did that for about 20 years. And then it turned out that, the collection was rather large, and I had 2 curators who were helping me manage the collection. And then I realized I can't buy any more Jamni Roys, because basically every time I proposed to the curators that I want to buy a new one, they looked at it and they said, no, it's just going to be a duplicate of what you have, or a variation of what you have, and it's not going to add to the collection. So then I started collecting other artists about 10, 15 years ago. Okay. And so then I collected New York Bengal School artists. I had collected some other early Bengal oils and Kalighats and all before that, but 60% of my acquisitions were Jamni Roy in a 20-year period. And then after that, only 40% were other artists. But then after that, in the last 10, 15 years, I also added some other artists. So now I've, ended up with, by default, one of the largest collection of Bengal school art between 1870 and 1950. That's my focus. Mm-hmm. It's about the emergence of modern Indian art. And the emergence of modern Indian art took place in a focused way at the Government College of Art in Calcutta around 1910. That is when Indian artists started asking the question, having been trained by the British art schools into Western academic art, they started asking the question, what is modern Indian art? And how is it different from Western academic art? And so there were various answers given at that time, of which 4 were the most prominent. One was the Bengal school led by Abhindranath Tagore, who basically rejected the Western academic art and took Mughal and Rajput inspiration, married it with Japanese wash techniques to make a pan-Asian movement. And that was the original Bengal nationalist school, the first nationalist school of art in modern Indian art history. Mm-hmm. But then there were 3 other artists who rebelled against that nationalist school, Bengal school. One was Hemen Mazumdar, who said, I love Western academic art, but I'm going to paint Indian femininity using Western academic art techniques, and that had never been done before. And he captured Indian femininity in a way which nobody else before or after has ever done. And basically, he's most famous for his wet sari paintings, which was the wet sari paintings from where Bollywood got its inspiration.
Okay.
The second artist was Jamni Roy, who said, I don't want to paint in the Western style. I want to paint in the Indian style, but I don't want to paint I want to be a modern artist, not like a traditional artist, the way Rabindranath Tagore and the nationalist movement is. So he dipped into the well of imagination of the Kalighat and the Patwa, Bengali Patwas, who did one unbroken line and then filled the plane with color. It was a very flat technique, which was the opposite of Western art, which was very much about perspective and light and about oil on canvas. And he stayed true to the Indian watercolor on paper and had a flat perspective. And so he's in some sense the father of Indian modern art and is the first, real visionary. And perhaps to even today, perhaps the only probably Indian artist who's been produced, who basically stands in the great artists of all time in terms of painting. And then the third artist was Rabindranath Tagore, who said, I'm Indian, I'm modern, whatever I paint is Indian modern art. And I don't want to be like a branded cattle that I have to produce something that is called Indian art. I produce whatever. And he was inspired by the German expressionists mostly. And his paintings as an untrained artist reflect his luxuriant imagination on paper. And he started painting at the age of 60, saying, there are some things, even after winning the Nobel Prize in Literature, that I cannot express in words. And so he started painting. And so those are the 3 or 4 major artists that I collect.
Okay. So, sir, you are actually an art lover, you are a researcher, a writer, and a teacher. So how these roles are complementing each other? How you think that they are supporting, or are these overlapping? How it helped you in general?
Basically, in strategy and in marketing, we teach be different or be extinct. And to some, that's what I teach in my marketing course. That's what I teach in my strategy course. And that is fundamentally what I've done in the art world also. Rather than collect what everybody else collects, I have a distinct positioning in the art world, which is about collecting Jamni Roy. That's where I made my distinct positioning. And after that, the Bengal school. So that is really what makes it a unique collection. To have a few of many artists makes for a collection. But to have a great collection, you have to limit yourself. Only then can your collection be more than the sum of the parts. And that's the same thing we teach in strategy, that, once you choose a distinctive positioning, then you make your entire value network consistent with that distinctive positioning. And for somebody else to copy that becomes very difficult. And that's what gives you the advantage. So whether it is in the art world, whether it's in the research world, whether it's in the academic world, these roles are, whether it's even as a teacher, I have a different, unique style of teaching. And it's all about this thing of having a unique selling proposition. What is it that makes you different as a collector? What is it that makes you different as a teacher? What is that makes you different as a researcher? And what is that makes you different as a company? So that is basically the fundamental underlying, engine on which everything is predicated. It's about learning, it's about constantly challenging yourself, and it's about being distinct or being extinct.
Yeah, amazing, sir. So you have written some books as well. So I will talk about 7 books. I've listed those 7 books. And I want to know from each book, what are the key learnings and why should one read those books? So first book, if I ask you, Thinking Smart.
So Thinking Smart is a book, which is perhaps my most autobiographical book. And basically in that book, it tells you the importance of really overcoming your deficits, which in my case is a low IQ and a low EQ, with hard work and good strategy. Because if you just do hard work and you don't have a good strategy, you'll waste your effort. So that book, I talk about my personal journey, about how despite having a low IQ and a low EQ, I managed to have some level of success by learning continuously, hard work, and a strategy, which was a distinctive strategy. So that's really what that book is about.
Okay. Your second book, Brand Breakout.
So Brand Breakout is a book where we said, in this book, we are going to look at how can emerging markets become global brands, especially in the Western world. And what we said was, just like 50, 60 years ago, you would have laughed if you would have said that Japanese brands would become global brands. And 30, 40 years ago, you would have laughed if South Korean brands would have been considered global brands. In this book, we talk about using these learnings. We say there are 8 different ways in which from an emerging market, you can become a global brand. And then the next set of global brands that are going to come to the world are going to be from China, just like they came from South Korea and Japan before that. And the advantage that China has over South Korea and Japan in terms of developing global brands is that when South Korea and Japan started the global brand journey, they started with really poor quality products.
Okay.
Whereas China, because they're the world's factory, are going to build these global brands on top of already having mastered world-class manufacturing. So it's going to be a lot easier for China to develop global brands. And you're already starting seeing the first few come out of them: Haier, Lenovo, Huawei, and I think it's going to continue in the future.
Okay. Your next book, India Inside.
So India Inside is in many ways a very interesting and very smart book, because based on that, my TED Talk has 1 million views. And so in India Inside, the big thing we were trying to say is that there's a lot of innovation going on in India where they are supporting the world's global product development. So in the world, whatever product development is being done by different companies, a large part of that support is being done by the R&D outsourcing in-house company ventures that have been set up by multinational companies in India, in Hyderabad, Bangalore, Delhi, Bombay also to some extent. And basically these R&D centers that multinational companies have set up in an emerging market, which is completely unique, they are not supporting India market, they are supporting the global market. And that was the whole point of that. And we said, based on this, we came up with some concepts like sinking skill ladder, that if the R&D is being supported out of India, then sooner or later, the multinational companies will have to say that right now we are outsourcing the bottom rung of the ladder, but for the next rung of the ladder, where do we get the people? Either we send the next rung of the ladder to India, or we import the Indians who are already ready for the next rung of the ladder into the overseas operations in the West. And so you see the development of this with the browning of the TMT, what we called, and the browning of the TMT, or the browning of the top management team. And so we predicted 12 years ago in that book that the browning of the TMT would take place on global multinational companies. And now you see in the last 12 years, Sundar Pichai, Krishna of IBM and all of this, which is what our point was in that book. So I'm very proud that we were 10 years ahead in terms of not documenting best practice, but documenting next practice.
Before reaching out to you, I actually heard your TED Talk and learned more about your books and all. So moving to your next book, which is on India's global powerhouses.
Yeah, so in that book was an interesting book, because at that time, 2007, 2008, Indian companies were doing global acquisitions in a very big way. And the big point in that book was that as the Indian market opened and the multinational companies took a great interest in the Indian market, Indian companies had to be globally competitive. They didn't have to be global, but they had to be globally competitive, otherwise they could not compete against these multinationals in their home market. And some percentage of these Indian companies, we said, would also go global. And that's what you saw at that time. But we also said in that book that acquiring global companies is relatively easy. Assimilating them is relatively more difficult. And that's what you see, that most of the global acquisitions made during that, gung-ho period, except for perhaps Novelis, which has been a success, most of the others have not really created economic value added for the acquiring company shareholders.
Okay. So moving to your fifth book, Value Merchants.
So Value Merchants was a book that was based on 20 years of consulting, which I'd done with B2B companies, where in B2B, I wanted to say that, those B2B marketing is very different from consumer marketing. Most of marketing is so enamored by consumer marketing, but we need to think of B2B. And in B2B marketing, because you have professional purchasing and procurement managers, you have to demonstrate the value of your offering compared to the next best alternative. In monetary terms. Okay. And we outlined a process in that book based on 200 companies we had worked with of how do you articulate in monetary terms, the value that you offer compared to the next best alternative for this customer, so that when the customer is comparing the price difference between you and the next best alternative, they're not comparing it to zero, but they're comparing it to this monetary value that you have calculated of your value difference. So that the value difference and the price difference are more consistent with each other, rather than in most cases in B2B marketing where we don't know the value difference in monetary terms. So very quickly we are negotiating against zero.
Okay. So your next book, what is about private label strategy?
So Private Label Strategy is a book I'm very proud of because it has the maximum academic citations of any of my books. And it was the first book which was a solid academic book written on private labels. And it became the Bible for many Indian retailers, as well as recently I had an email from a Portuguese retailer who said, I used your book to develop our private label for our retailing firm. Okay. So that that book was really about private labels, which is the retailer brands, how they can compete against manufacturer brands, and why they will continue to become stronger and have a bigger share of the market. And then we also had several chapters on how manufacturers can compete against private labels. And we said they can never reduce the share of private label, but they can fight selectively and be effective against private labels and hold their own. And one of the ways they can hold their own is to either be niche premium or be the #1 brand in the category.
Okay, okay. And the last book, Marketing as Strategy.
So that was my first book, my favorite book, because it was the first book. And in that book, I basically had spent already 20 years in the consulting world when I wrote that book. And that book was really outlining in many ways what I had learned about marketing, working with companies, and why marketing as a profession is not respected by CEOs. And I said, if marketers want to be respected by CEOs, they have to change the language that they use. They have to change how they talk about marketing, and they have to make marketing more strategic, more cross-functional, and more bottom line oriented. And if they don't do that, then they can't expect CEO attention, because CEOs are only interested in problems that are cross-functional, that are strategic, and that are bottom line oriented. All other problems will be solved before they get to the CEO's desk. And so I talked about certain transformations that marketing people can lead that would have these 3 characteristics. And so that way marketers could come under the attention of the CEO and be attracted by the CEO's eye.
So when I was teaching at IIM Amritsar, I used your book to refer and teach Marketing as Strategy to my strategy students, actually.
Thank you.
Sir, one last question which I have, because you have so many years of experience, and this is more towards a philosophical perspective, which I'm looking for from your life journey so far. If you look back and reflect, how would you be able to define your life in one statement?
So basically, I would say, I'm about being curious, being continuously learning, always into improvement, self-improvement, constantly becoming a better version of myself compared to yesterday. I don't look for long-term goals. I don't look for short-term goals. All I look for is, how do I become better today compared to what I was yesterday? And that is my goal, and to continuously do my best. And because if I do my best, then nobody can ask anything more of me. And I should not expect anything less of myself. And I combine that with an irreverence towards authority. So that when I read an article, no matter how famous the person is who's written the article, I don't become starry-eyed. I say, what is wrong with this article, so that I can prove that this article has a mistake and it is wrong under these conditions. And it's the same thing. I don't reify companies. I don't reify people. I learn what I can, what they do well, and then I say, what could I do better based on what I've learned from them.
Amazing, sir. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. I am going to learn a lot from your books, I'm sure, and a lot of concepts are going to be used for import hub internationalization, or maybe globalization in the coming times. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I hope that your listeners find something of value in this talk.
Definitely, sir. It's great to see you all here. Thank you for watching our work. If you have not subscribed to Import Hub Media, then please hit the bell icon and subscribe to our channel and support research celebrations in India.